So welcome back to this third part of the Christadelphian video talk on the strength of the evidence for a young Earth, when we're going to look at the principles, flaws and assumptions with the dating methods that are used to tell us that the Earth is very old, but that doesn't fit with what the Bible has to say. So if we just look at time scales, the Bible talks about a creation 6,000 years ago. It wasn't until the 1800s, really, when these evolutionary ideas began to come along. And John Phillips, he in 1841 proposed that the Earth was 96 million years old, and that was based upon his observations of the rate of sedimentation and measuring how much sediment was laid down in a period, and then looking at the geological column and the height of the geological column. Well, he estimated 96 million years to arrive at the amount of sedimentation that we have. And then it wasn't until the 1890s that Lord Kelvin comes along and, using a totally different method, arrived at a rather similar 100 million years ago. So he was looking at the surface temperature of the Earth and his estimates of what the core temperature was, and saying, well, originally when the Earth was formed, that the core temperature must have been its temperature. It is now cooled to what we have on the surface today. And he worked out a rate of cooling, working backwards from the temperature on the outside to the temperature on the inside, came up with this 100 million years. It wasn't until 1898 when Marie Curie discovered the phenomena of radioactivity. And it was in 1904 that Ernest Rutherford realized that this could be a clock to show us how old the Earth was. And the work was picked up by a young student, a young geologist, Arthur Holmes, who was studying for a geology degree at the Imperial College of Science in London. And he began to work out, using radioactive decay, and arrived at an age of 1.6 billion years. That was in 1913. And he devoted his life to this work, and it just got older and older. It got to 3 billion years in 1927. And in the 1940s, arrived at about 4.5 billion, which is very roughly the age of the Earth that's used today, 4.6 or 4.7 billion years. You can see the big difference between the Bible timescale. Now we're up here 750,000 times longer. So let's have a look at how they arrive at these dates. So there is what is known as a geological column. Incidentally, there is nowhere on Earth where there is a complete column. It is made from showing this layer was on top of that layer, on top of that layer in this part of the world. And then we find that layer over here, which has got this and this above it. And so pieced together what was this column from Precambrian up to today, and the fossils that one would expect to find in those layers. And then later on, this time scale, with the advent of the dating processes, the radioactive dating processes, then the dating in the right-hand column was added. And so if we find, for instance, a dinosaur bone, then one consults the column and finds, well, the age of the dinosaurs existed from 146 to 66 million years ago. So if you find a dinosaur fossil, it'll be somewhere in that time period. So how are these dates on the right-hand side arrived at? Well, they've been arrived at by radiometric dating. And this is one of the great things about this geological column. As I say, nowhere on Earth do we find in any one spot all these different layers. Very often we find huge chunks missing. Sometimes we find layers reversed so that an alleged older rock is on top of a younger rock. But this is the basis upon which evolution builds its case. So let's look at radiometric dating. There's a number, far more than there are there, but different ways using different chemicals. So uranium to lead is uranium, as it decays, forms lead. And so you start off with uranium, and after a long period of time, you end up with lead. And by measuring the amount of uranium and the amount of lead, then you can arrive at a dating process by knowing what the half-life of uranium to lead is. And these are all different methods that can be used. So how does it work? So it's measuring the amount of radioactive decay in elements that are in the rock. Now, nearly all those methods can only be used on rocks. They can't be used on once living material. And they can only be used on rocks which are igneous, in other words, volcanic. Can't be used on sedimentary rocks where the fossils are found. So it can be used for dating lava flows, volcanoes, volcanic ash, and granite, of course, is formed volcanically, so granites can be dated. Now, carbon-14 is in a different category because that can be used on once living material. So anything that was, say, coal, which was a tree, or bones, or cloth, or wood, or fibres, or pollen from trees, one can use carbon-14 on it. And the basis of carbon-14 is that there's nitrogen-14 in the air, which is constantly having cosmic radiation on it, which turns that nitrogen-14 into carbon-14, which, along with carbon dioxide, the trees absorb. That's their function in life, to absorb the carbon dioxide and to, in its place, absorb it, change it to oxygen, so the air is constantly being oxygenated so that life can exist. And as we said in the first part, the animals, and humans being animals, we eat leaves, shoots, plants, and in so doing, we take this carbon into us, along with carbon-14, this radioactive carbon which decays. And when we die, then we stop eating, and the clock, as it were, starts ticking. And by measuring the amount of carbon-14 that remains in a body or in a sample of pollen or whatever it is, once living material, then we can work out an age. And the half-life is the important thing, and that's the stage at which the parent, the carbon-14 in this case, is 100%, so that's the point of death. But there comes a period in time when the daughter element, nitrogen-14 in this case, they are in balance, and that's then called a half-life. because you've got half parent and half daughter. And for carbon-14, that's 5,700 years. So by being able to measure the amount of carbon-14 compared with nitrogen-14, you can see how many half-lives have gone, and therefore you can then apply the dating process and arrive at a date for that particular sample. Now, going back to our first example of uranium and lead, here we have a time glass, as it were, and we assume that we start off with a uranium, and we have just taken a snapshot where we are at a half-life, because if you count up the number of atoms of uranium and the number of atoms of lead, they are equal. And the half-life, we're told, of uranium to lead is a staggering 704 million years. So a very long half-life. Now, there are three big assumptions that have to be made. One is that when we start, there was only uranium present. There was no lead elements. So that's the first big assumption, that we start off with a pure uranium. The other is that the rate of change which we observe today has always existed, that there wasn't a big catastrophe like the flood to cause changes. So we have to assume present is the key to the past. So the change, the rate that we see today has always existed. But that's a big assumption. And the third assumption is that, yes, the lead is only from the decay of the uranium, that there was no lead present at the start. Now, the problem is we've got no means of checking these assumptions because we weren't there when these things happened. Now, if we went into a laboratory and we saw a liquid dripping into a measuring cylinder, when we went in, it was measuring 300 milliliters of the liquid. We could work out the speed at which the liquid was dripping in. And if we just waited a little while and in half an hour we reached 325, then we would have said, well, in 30 minutes, we've got 50. If it takes us 30 minutes to add another 25 milliliters, then in an hour, we've got 50 milliliters an hour. So we can say, yeah, we can check the drip rate into there. So we can ask the simple question, well, we've got 300 milliliters of liquid in our cylinder. So, and the drip rate is 500 milliliters an hour. So how long has the tap been dripping to give us 300 milliliters into the cylinder? Now, if we were all bright at maths, we would, I think, come up with the answer, well, 6 hours, because 6 times 50 comes to 300. But that could be the right answer. But A could be the right answer. It's only been dripping for 3 hours because there was already some water in the cylinder to begin with. Now, we were got no means of knowing. We weren't there. We just come in at this end of time, as it were, and done an observation. And from that observation, we've come up with 6 hours. But if there was 150 milliliters of water in there at the beginning, then 3 hours would be the right answer. Or we measure the drip rate now, but was it always dripping at 500 milliliters an hour? Has it been slowing down? And therefore, 3 hours is the correct answer, and it was empty to begin with. Equally, 9 hours might be the correct answer, because if the drip rate has been slowing down, and it wasn't initially dripping at 50 milliliters an hour, then it could have been dripping for 9 hours in order to put it. So if the drip rate had speeded up, as I think perhaps I said it the wrong way around, the drip rate had speeded up, it was faster and then got slower and slower and slower. It could have taken, we can't tell, we weren't there. So you can see the problems. We have to assume it was empty at the start, drip rate was constant, none has been lost during the time, because it could have been, yes, it has been dripping at 50 millilitres now, but it's been very hot in this laboratory and a lot of water has evaporated. So it has been dripping for 9 hours. You can see the problems. It's not an easy thing to work out the age when you weren't there, you didn't see it from the beginning. So if we trust the Bible, then these assumptions are wrong, because we didn't start from nothing, as we saw. We started from a mature earth, salt in the sea, carbon dioxide for the plants, etc., and nitrogen-14 in the atmosphere. So we didn't start with an empty measuring cylinder. We started with one that had, well, we don't know how full it was, but it wasn't nothing at the beginning. And the Bible tells us a world-shattering, catastrophic flood. So the present isn't the key to the past. So not a steady drip rate, leaching taking place. And so that completely upsets the calculations. And with the Earth underwater, as I say, the Earth would appear to be much older than it really is. Now, there's very good evidence, there's not this talk, another talk, that the rock strata that we see today, containing all the fossils, was laid down at the time of the flood. These were creatures which were in existence at the start of the flood day and were overwhelmed by the flood water, were rapidly buried with all the sediment that was being carried around when the foundations of the earth broke up, and the rock strata formed in the time of the flood. And so their age isn't billions of years, but a few thousand years old. Now, when uranium decays to lead, it also forms helium. Now, when we're testing zircon crystals, which contain uranium decaying to lead, the amount of helium in them gives a totally different age to the lead decaying, the uranium decaying to lead, which gives an age of 1.5 billion years. But the helium in them yields a much shorter date of about 5,680 years. So there's some imbalance there. There's something totally wrong with this method. It's not giving us a true date. And when in fact we look at examples such as Mount St. Helens, which is, was witnessed, I was alive, saw the pictures of it happening. That strata, which we know was laid down in a very short period, just a matter of days, when they came to do tests on it yielded ages of 350,000 years, and the mineral content gave ages from about that to 2.5 million years. And yet we know it didn't exist until 40 years ago. So there's something very basically wrong in these dating processes. And in New Zealand, there's a mountain, Daruhoi, and that has been erupting, and they know from records that there was a lot of eruptions from 1945 to 1975. And again, when they dated that, then it gave ages of 2.5 million years. And other methods, because there are so many methods you can use, go from 13.3 million to 3.9 billion years. And yet we know that this didn't exist until 1945 to 75, so very comparatively recently. So again, there's something very basically wrong with the dating processes. This is something which we have seen and doesn't fit the traditional datum. So we don't have to put trust in, well, the Earth we've shown through science is very, very old, so the Bible can't be true. Actually, science has proved that evolutionary dating is incorrect. There's no reason to believe that the Earth isn't the age that God tells us of 6,000 years ago when he brought the Earth into being.